on innovative landscape approach organized by IFRI, CCAFS, and the Forest Dialogue. To answer the challenge that the Global Landscape Forum posed to us, how can we produce enough food for 9 billion people by 2015 without destroying the forest or accelerating climate change? We're really looking at innovative landscape approach that can stimulate new collaborative actions cross sectors and break down the barriers between institutions. And in this technical session, we'll explore two new approaches. One is looking at a collaborative multi-stakeholder cross-sectoral partnership that brings together private sector, NGOs, government, communities, indigenous peoples to work together and look at what are the innovation out there and stimulate collaborative actions to work towards different innovative approach. And this platform really is based on different evidence that some of the new research is providing and some of the new framework that different research studies is producing. So we will also hear a new research topic that's done by CCAF, IFRI, and Imaflora, looking at how we can assess the sustainability of commodity supply chains and enhance them to improve environmental, social, and economic outcomes. We will also try to make this session as interactive as possible. So after the two presentations, we will have a panel discussion to delve more in depth into those key issues that the speakers raised, and we also will be joined by a representative from World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and also a representative from the Strategic Affairs Ministry for the President Office in Brazil. We'll also open the session to interactions with you guys in the room, and also we have an online audience joining us with this online streamed session as well. So we'll be getting some of the questions, comments from you at the end of the session, and we hope that you can also interact with us and let us know what different innovative approaches that your organization are working on as well. So without further ado, I want to introduce the first presenter, Gary Downing, who is the Executive Director of the Forest Dialogue. The Forest Dialogue was created in 1999 to provide global and regional leaders in the forest sector with a multi-stakeholder dialogue platform and a process. This process focuses on developing mutual trust and a shared understanding while working towards collaborative solutions to the challenges in achieving sustainable forest management and forest conservation. And Gary has been the Executive Director of TFD since 2000. And I also work for the Forest Dialogue as a program manager. So Gary, hand over to you.
Thank you, Xiaoting. And I want to thank everybody today for coming this afternoon, and those of you online as well. As Xiaoting said, what I hope to do is kind of give you an introduction to the consortium of organizations that's working on this, what we call the Food, Fuel, Fiber, and Forest Challenge. And I'll tell you how we've come to create an organization around that and a focus on the engagement process and bringing those stakeholders together, as well as I'll tell you a little bit about a dialogue that we had in Brazil, and that will link to the presentations that we have after mine. So our initiative is called the 4Fs Initiative, and as Xiaoting said, and as is the context by which this forum has been developed, we're looking at how do we feed close to 9 billion people by the year 2050 and still maintain conservation values in the forest and other related ecosystem values. Essentially, we're looking at how are we going to produce more with less land, potentially less water, and hopefully less pollution. So this is the world as resources are now utilized across the landscape: farmland, logged forest, unlogged forest, plantations, and ecosystems. This is a snapshot. This is pulled from a recent WWF report that also deals with these issues. As you can see, obviously the greater share of the pie is allocated to farmland and agricultural interests, but other systems and values and uses are distributed across the landscape. If we don't address the challenges, the new demands, the landscape use conundrum, then we're faced with what is coined the big squeeze. It's where agricultural interests kind of push out more traditional landscape, forest use, forest conservation, plantations also kind of spread across the landscape. This obviously will lead to higher greenhouse gas emissions and ultimately a decline in biodiversity. So this is the challenge that our organizations have come together to address more directly. Again, the key challenges being ag expansion that is leading to deforestation, challenges, food security being a major and important focus now, but trying to understand how food security can be understood and dealt with while not negatively impacting mitigation and conservation efforts. And ultimately, the lack of engagement between the various land uses and actors that are supporting those land uses, and then how all that plays into the climate initiatives that are helping to address the climate, but maybe sometimes be conflicting with other conservation initiatives. So based on those challenges, we created the 4Fs initiative. The initiative is built around the model that the Forest Dialogue established in 2000. It's the engage, explore, and change aspects of bringing stakeholders together, bringing leaders together, helping them build trust, helping them understand their shared challenges, but ultimately working with those leaders to build collaborative solutions. So these organizations have joined together with the Forest Dialogue to build this 4Fs initiative. The core of the platform, again, the Forest Dialogue's role in this process, in this initiative, is to build these platforms for engagement. And the particular challenges, the forest sector has a relatively long history, not always on the best of terms, but it has a long history of dialogue about the challenging issues with forest conservation and forest management. The agriculture sector has less of a history and less of a culture of engagement and dialogue within that sector, and particularly across sectors. So our challenge is working to bring in those agricultural interests more directly and engage as a platform that's looking for compromise, shared understanding of the challenges, but also seeking shared solutions. The engage phase is the phase we're in now. This is the process that we're working on directly. Next phase is the explore phase, or actually happening concurrently, and that's a research phase. So you can see some of these organizations, particularly CCAFS and CIFOR, but the others, IID, WRI, World Bank, FAO, they all kind of lead research initiatives. And what we're trying to do is bring that research together and help inform the debate, help inform the dialogue, and from those learnings, be able to build, again, more shared action plans about how to address those challenges. Ultimately, what we're looking to do, though, is to kind of change, look at improving land use decision-making processes on the ground, but also as it takes place on an international level, and move us all towards a more landscape-based approach to the 4F's challenge. These are the targets that we have over the next few years that the initiative is working to build cross-sectoral, multi-stakeholder platforms to drive innovative landscape approaches at national and international levels, to identify best practice with landscape-level land use decision-making, and to engage commodity supply chains to broaden support and move certification towards a more landscape-based approach. Again, the core here is to build greater coordination among the different interests across the landscape in trying to build collaborative solutions. That's a quick introduction to the 4F's initiative. And now I want to talk about one of our first activities was a multi-stakeholder dialogue that we held in Brazil in November of 2012. I'll give you a little bit of the highlights of that process, and then we'll hear more about some of the other aspects of the work in Brazil from our colleagues on the panel. But as you can see, the Brazilian case for us presented a very good model about the trade-offs and the challenges of landscape-level land use decision-making. In where we were in Capo Bonito, the primary pressure was from cattle and also from soya, particularly and as it related to forest conservation in that area outside the Atlantic or near the Atlantic forest. While we were on the ground, while we were part of that dialogue, we identified these challenges the challenges that we saw across the landscape. Challenges such as how to intensify land uses without causing environmental or social harm. The Forest Dialogue has another initiative on genetically modified trees, and in that particular initiative, we're talking with different stakeholders about their perceptions and understanding and opposition or promotion of genetically modified trees. So with the understanding that potentially GM trees, if deployed across landscape, would they be able to address some of these intensification challenges? Obviously, a similar debate has been happening on GM crops and whatnot. So this is a debate that needs to continue, but we want to look at it in the context of landscapes. How do we conduct integrated, participatory, and rights-based land use planning? Again, this relates to another Forest Dialogue initiative. We have an initiative on practical implementation on free prior informed consent. So we're looking at how does FPIC, in reality, how do you do FPIC on the ground with the various actors, be it government or corporations or other actors on the landscape, and how that might be able to help positively influence this discussion about integrated, participatory, and rights-based approaches. We need to understand how to better value ecosystem services so that the services provided by the forests aren't easily displaced by the need to feed 9 billion people, the need for food security, which again is a key and important need, but we need to try to understand better how we can do the integrated management and look at across the landscape and not just a specific location and land use. We want to work towards supporting family-based sustainable forestry, smaller scale forestry. How can we do that in the context of the large agribusiness? Can large agribusiness find ways to work with smaller farmers? I think we see that to a certain degree with the large forest corporations that have outgrower schemes where they work with small farmers to produce wood for their needs. So are there similar models available in the agriculture sector to support sustainable family farming? One key challenge that obviously was identified in Brazil and internationally is the need to change consumption patterns. I note that because it's obvious, it's the big elephant in the room, but I also have to say that that's not directly one of the points that the Forest Dialogue is working on, but many other organizations are. But it's obviously a big challenge that needs to be addressed. And finally, in fora like this and other fora, to work to create international standards and policies that particularly help local initiatives and more small-scale attempts to build landscape-level decision-making processes. So this initiative is working on an international level to help foster policy that helps support more local initiatives. Finally, so based on the Brazil dialogue, these are some of the ideas that we're taking forward through the 4Fs initiative. One, and probably the key for an organization like ours, is to build a national platform on the engagement of 4Fs. And as an outcome of the Brazil dialogue, a group of local stakeholders came together and established a national platform where the 4Fs discussion is continuing in Brazil. And it's based on that engagement, that continued engagement, based on the breadth of stakeholders that are engaged there, that we're hopeful that some of the other ways forward might be able to be realized on the ground in Brazil. Integrated and participatory land use planning is also an important way forward. Again, this is based on multi-stakeholder engagement, cross-sectoral, and bottom-up approach. Also related to this is research and mapping to understand in local areas the best approach for the integrated and participatory planning. We're working to support family farming, and that's via extension initiatives, collaboration at different scales. Again, where there are opportunities for large agribusiness to support and work with smaller family scale farms and farming. We're looking at the local to global supply chain management. Again, this is cross-sectoral. As we know, there's emerging roundtables and supply chain commodity certification standards developing. And it's absolutely key that those different developments begin to engage and talk to each other, and so that the different schemes can take on more of a landscape-based approach rather than a more siloed, strictly commodity-based approach. So we're looking to support that in Brazil and beyond. And finally, coordinate international guidance on land use. And as I mentioned before, we're looking to map existing guides to best practice in land use decision making, and then based on that, through this initiative, develop a kind of a guide to guides, I guess is the best way to put it, a guide to best practice guides, but also to be able to implement pilots on the ground so that that guide can be tested and improved where possible. So that's again, that's a relatively brief overview of what we've been doing in the 4Fs initiative and with the dialogue in Brazil. I'll just mention that this 4Fs initiative continues. We had the Brazil dialogue. Next will be a dialogue in Indonesia, where we will be looking at the oil palm effect on oil palm in Kalimantan and the transition of natural forest landscapes over to oil palm. That will be in March of next year. Those of you that do research or are active in Indonesia and would like to participate in that dialogue, I encourage you to send us a note. Part of that dialogue, as in Brazil, will be to look to develop a national platform to discuss 4Fs issues in Indonesia. And then, after Indonesia, we're looking to develop a dialogue in Finland, again, looking at best practice on landscape level decision-making and management. So with that, thank you for that, and look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel and to talk about in more detail what's going on in Brazil with the research and whatnot. So thank you.
Thanks, Gary. As Gary mentioned, local global supply chain management is one of the key ways forward. And next, we'll hear from 3 presenters looking deeper into how certification can help on local and global supply chain management. And I'm going to just quickly introduce the 3 speakers. Peter Newton, who is an interdisciplinary scientist who works in tropical forests and agriculture landscapes. He currently leads a research collaboration between the University of Michigan and CCAFS that studies innovative supply chain intervention in palm oil and the cattle sectors. Peter also joined us at the 4Fs Brazil dialogue. Gary just mentioned, and CCAFS is part of that 4Fs partnership. And Mrs. Marina Piatto, who has been working at Imaflora, a Brazilian NGO, in the field of agriculture and climate projects. Her work involves the certification of farms based on good agriculture practices, environmental conservation, and human rights under the Sustainable Agriculture Network Rainforest Alliance as well. And Helena Pinto, who works as an environmental consultant focusing on economic incentives for tropical forest conservation. Together with the University of Michigan and the CCAFS, Helena is also on part of the research project aims at understanding how the Brazilian institutional context influences the development of the Sustainable Agriculture Network cattle certification program. So I'll hand over to Pete.
Thanks, Xiaoting, and thanks, Gary, for that presentation. So it's great to be here, and we're going to talk for the next 20 minutes or so about this research collaboration between the University of Michigan and CCAFS, which is now a 2-year-long collaboration. And we're going to talk specifically about a case study that we've been conducting in collaboration additionally with Imaflora in Brazil. So our research project as a whole is interested in some of the emerging innovative mechanisms to improve agricultural sustainability in tropical forest landscapes. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to that project as a whole, and then we're going to focus most of the presentation on the case study from Brazil. I should just say as well that as Xiaoting mentioned, I attended the 4Fs dialogue in Brazil, and in no small part that played a role in facilitating and introducing our collaboration with Imaflora. So for that, among many other reasons, I can speak for the 4Fs dialogue as being a useful and very constructive process. So the main question that has been driving our research project as a whole is to understand how the sustainability of commodity supply chains can be enhanced to improve environmental, social, and economic outcomes, specifically in tropical forest regions. And so as we know, commodity agriculture is associated with high rates of deforestation in many parts of the world, and there are many seemingly disparate interventions that are emerging to try and improve sustainability within the commodity agriculture sector. And some of these focus at producer practices and the way that agriculture takes place. Some are focused at increasing consumer demand for sustainably produced products. But there have been relatively few efforts to evaluate different interventions in terms of their characteristics, in terms of their structure, in terms of the mechanisms of change, and in terms of the potential impacts that they might achieve. And in part, that's been because there have been few sort of common approaches or methods to do so in a way that is comparable across commodities, across countries, across contexts. So one of the first things we worked on within this research was to develop a sort of conceptual framework as a way of generalizing and drawing together different interventions in a comparable manner. And so just very briefly, we think about the actors that implement a given intervention as in the broad categories of state, market, and civil society actors. We sort of generalize or characterize interventions as being broadly based on some combination of institutions and policies, incentives and disincentives, and information and technology. And then we think about where on the supply chain those interventions act, whether they act on the producers or on the consumers or at some intermediary node along the supply chain. And finally, we think about characterizing the possible impacts of those interventions in terms of environmental, social, and economic outcomes. We've been subsequently applying this framework in 4 different case studies. So in Indonesia and Brazil, so mostly in the context of palm oil production and cattle production in Indonesia and Brazil, respectively. And we've been looking at different novel emerging interventions, both private sector and civil society initiated. And so those have included, for example, in Indonesia, an independent initiative by a large palm oil company to adopt an independent set of standards to improve practices within their company, and a comparative analysis of 2 different approaches to certification, looking at a civil society and consortium-driven certification program compared to an industry roundtable-driven certification program. And then, so those are examples of what we've been doing. You can, if you're interested in reading more about the framework and our sort of conceptual approach to this work, then this paper, we published this paper a couple of months ago, and that's available to download, or I can send it to anyone who can't access that directly. Oh, this is the wrong version, so I'm going to keep going. And then what we want to focus on for the rest of the presentation is this case study in Brazil that we've just published just a few days ago, which is the collaboration with Imaflora. And this has been looking at the new Sustainable Agriculture Network certification program for cattle in Brazil. So this is available online as well from the CCAFS from the CCAFS publication page. But for the rest of to sort of highlight some of the main findings and most interesting aspects of this study, I'm going to hand over to Marina first, and then to Helena.
Hello, I would like just to introduce Imaflora. Imaflora is a Brazilian NGO, and we work with forest and agriculture management, and we start to work also now in Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. So Imaflora is a member of a coalition of 9 NGOs called the Sustainable Agriculture Network. And the group of these NGOs they link responsible farmers with consumers. The SUN, they call it the Sustainable Agriculture Network, it's called SUN, it's an abbreviation, and it was developed in 1992. They started to develop the standard, and this standard is to promote social and environmental benefits and also best agriculture practices in the supply chain. So the standard is divided in 10 principles that integrates biodiversity and water conservation, social responsibility, and best agriculture practices. So the 8 NGOs are from Latin America and 1 is from India. And together we build the network, and this network certifies the farms all over the world. In 43 countries we are now, and we all use the Rainforest Alliance label in the products. So the standard was built in following the ICO guidelines. So we are ICO member, and ICOs guarantee that the standards were developed through a transparent method with public consultations. And today we have around 2.7 million hectares certified and more than 60 crops all over the world. Mainly it's coffee, orange, cocoa, and now cattle. And we certify individual farms, groups of small farmers, and also the chain of custody, that is the industry that take the raw material and produce the products. So we certify the whole supply chain to keep the traceability of the sustainable raw material. So I will talk about the SUN standard, like a summary. The SUN standard, the main standard is divided in 10 principles. And these 10 principles talk about the farm management, the water conservation, biodiversity, social responsibility, and best agriculture management. So beside this main standard, we build through the public consultations the SUN standard for sustainable cattle production. So this is an additional standard with 5 principles and 36 additional criteria. It was launched in 2010 with public consultation in 34 countries all over the world. And these principles are complementary to the main standard. So the first one is specific for carbon reduction emissions through improved nutrition, manure management, optimizing productivity. We incentivize also agroforestry system and shaded pastures. And every farm must have the minimum 20% of the natural ecosystem conserved. So this is about the carbon emissions. The second, the third, and the fourth principles, they talk about best cattle management practices. The first one is animal welfare, which includes transportation and no mistreat the animals, food and water sufficient for them. And the third and fourth, it's integrate cattle management and pasture management. And the fifth principle is an additional environmental principle for conservation requirements, that it's the main topic, it's zero deforestation, and also the high value ecosystem must not have been destroyed since 2005. So the farms who destroyed high value ecosystems before 2005, after 2005, they cannot be certified. So today, this program represents the highest level of sustainability in the cattle supply chain in Brazil. And my last slide is to show to start with the example of São Marcelo farm. That is the first sustainable cattle certified in the world with the Rainforest Alliance stamp. São Marcelo is is located in the transition between the Cerrado and Amazon biomes. So it's a very important region where the deforestation is really driving inside the Amazon biome. And we certified 3 farms. They are 3 units that make São Marcelo. One big farm of 33,000 hectares. From these 33,000 hectares, around 20,000 is only conservation areas. And they are inside the Mato Grosso state, which is the state that produces more cattle in Brazil. It's the biggest producer in Brazil. Also, to keep the traceability, we certify a slaughtering house from IFRI group that is placed in Tangará da Serra. So the cows, they go to the slaughtering house, and then we keep the traceability from the origin. And Carrefour is selling the beef now in São Paulo, in like 7 supermarkets in São Paulo city. So it was possible to certify São Marcelo because they already have a very high quality management practices in place. So before they were organic, and then they started to use some fertilizers, so they chose the Rainforest Alliance certification. And this enabled, we showed that it's possible to certify sustainable beef in Amazon, so to keep conservation and production. And this is like just one more example, as Imaflora did with coffee, orange, and other crops in Brazil, and they were the pioneers for beef. So then Helena is going to explain you the methodology she studied this case. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So just to continue the presentation, can you hear me well? Yeah. All right. So the impact of an intervention depends, of course, on the design and structure of the program, as Marina was describing, but also it depends on the context where it's being implemented and on other interventions that are being implemented at the same time in the same place. So the extent to which the Sand Cattle program will have an impact on deforestation in Brazil will actually depend on how it's going to be supported and constrained by several interventions that are being developed at the same time and the contextual factors in Brazil. So considering this, the principal aim of this work was to understand how the Sand Cattle certification program's aim of to reduce deforestation in Brazil is supported and constrained by other interventions and by contextual factors. To do so, we gathered primary data from semi-structured interviews with several actors from the cattle supply chain in Brazil. We covered different sectors as well, such as government. We interviewed, for example, the environmental ministry, civil society, where we interviewed several NGOs and researchers, and the private sector as well, such as slaughterhouses and producers. In total, we interviewed 46 people from 28 organizations, and we visited also one SAN-certified slaughterhouse and one SAN-certified farm in Tangará da Serra, as Marina showed you in the map, as well as a couple of non-certified farms up north in the same state, Mato Grosso. Here we have a diagram showing the wide range of interventions that we have that are being developed in Brazil to enhance sustainability in the cattle supply chain directly or indirectly. These are characterized according to the framework that Pete just mentioned. So according to the as institutions and policies, incentives, or information and policies. Can I? I don't and also by which sector developed each of the interventions. So the civil society in green, government, private sectors, and we have also some combinations of these sectors to develop one intervention. Just to give some examples, we have the Forest Code or the Rural Environmental Registry or CAR, or the low carbon agriculture, to give an example of each of the characteristics of them. We analyzed the institutional arrangements associated to these interventions, and our data led us to 4 key challenges to the development and scaling up of the sand cattle program. So the first main challenge is that there are still many cattle farmers in Brazil that are not compliant with fundamental environmental laws. So although Brazil has a very strict environmental law regarding forests, which we call the Forest Code that I presented to you, there is still very little enforcement, effective enforcement toward compliance. So we have lots of producers that are still not compliant with the law. The problem here is that the sand cattle certification requires, as a basic first step, that all the producers have to be compliant with the Forest Code. And therefore, the ones that are not compliant are far from contemplating the sand cattle certification. Of course, there are several programs or interventions that are being developed in order to promote compliance among producers. I'm going to give just 2 examples for you to have an idea. So we have the conduct adjustment terms, which are terms signed by slaughterhouses and retailers, where they provide assurance they're just going to buy cattle and beef from legally compliant producers, for example. This way, they exclude all the non-compliant ones from the market. This is one strategy. Another one, which is more indirect, is by monitoring programs. So we have an example, the Project Satellite Imagery. So based on satellite imagery, you know where the focus of deforestation are, so you can have better enforcement and focus on these areas. Or you can use this data to, in these other programs, to have better enforcement and agreements. Nevertheless, we still have a lot of, until compliance is achieved, many producers are not going to be able to contemplate certification. So it would be interesting to give more support to interventions that facilitate environmental compliance, particularly to the small producers who are the ones with the least access to information, technical assistance, and capital to promote these changes and achieve compliance. The second challenge is that there is little direct financial incentives for farmers to change their practice and increase sustainability. So it seems from our interviews that the main incentive for them is from these direct incentives, financial incentives, such as price premiums, for example. And the problem is that there's still the beef, certified beef, is not yet associated with a significant price premium. And so we heard from many non-certified producers that they would be really interested in certifying and increasing their sustainability practices if the returns would pay off their investments. That was interesting. And on the other hand, when talking to certified actors, they highlighted some non-direct financial benefits, such as, for example, they had improved efficiency in their practices, or they had secure contracts with slaughterhouses, or even high reputation in the national and international market. So it could be valuable to highlight these non-direct financial benefits to incentivize the other producers to adhere to certification. Fine, so I mentioned that price premiums are still not high in the cattle sector, the certified beef in Brazil. And this might be related to the market that is not yet, that's still limited in the country. And this leads us to our next challenge, which is that there is a need to concurrently increase demand for and supply of sustainable products to overcome this chicken and egg problem of suppliers depending on consumers and retailers buying their sustainable, so creating demand, and the consumers and retailers depending on the suppliers to create all the supply. The context here is that Brazil produced more than 70% of the beef produced in Brazil is consumed domestically. And although the willingness to pay among consumers is increasing for sustainable products, it's still much lower than other export markets, for example, the EU or the USA. So maybe it would be interesting. There are several things that could be done, but what we could mention here is that there is a need to promote domestic demand for sustainable consumption in Brazil to increase this willingness to pay for sustainable products. And also to maybe increase the supply for certified beef, focusing on, for example, the external markets who are willing to pay more for or have more this practice of paying for sustainable products. And finally, and more generally, to encourage commitment to sustainability throughout the supply chain, the whole supply chain. The last challenge is that there are many interventions developed in the sector, but there are sometimes poorly coordinated, or sometimes they might be in competition among each other. So for example, we have some private standards that in the supermarket shelf might be competing with the Rainforest Alliance beef, for example, or even might be making the consumers a little bit confused about what each standard means, how sustainable that is. So this might lead to confusion. Another example is are some interventions that are developed at subnational scales, and sometimes it's hard to make it become to increase or to scale up. So it's necessary. It would be very interesting to create a strategic coordination between these interventions to achieve the sustainability goals. And this is already starting to happen in Brazil by the development of multi-stakeholder interventions, or even by the Roundtable for Sustainable Livestock, the Brazilian Roundtable, which is gathering actors through from the different actors from the cattle supply chain in Brazil, and perhaps could be a good path for coordinating different interventions. And just to sum up here, I think we could think of progress toward sustainability as seeing as different sets of steps, as you can see here in this picture. And the Cattle standard seems to set higher criteria for sustainability, higher than any other program in the cattle supply chain in Brazil right now. But because it sets higher criteria, it raises the sustainability bar in the cattle supply chain. And the problem here is that because of that, just a few very sustainable farms are able to achieve certification. And that's where the other complementary interventions get in, because they're able to enhance the sustainability from the bottom up of the chain. And so, for example, by helping to promote environmental compliance, or to give people technical assistance, or even to help give incentives to adherence to other programs, for example. Just to wrap up here and addressing the very first questions that Pete posed in his first slide. So how can the sustainability of commodity supplies chain be enhanced to improve environmental, social, and economic outcomes? So we see that the Send Cattle program attempts to do that by defining high standards of sustainability in the cattle supply chain. And there are many obstacles that we found with this research, but we have to focus our efforts and focus on, for example, enforcing compliance through producers, or creating meaningful incentives for participation, developing supply and demand concurrently, and finally, by developing complementary interventions that are coordinated between each other. I guess that's it. Thank you very much. And for more information, please contact us.
Thanks to all the speakers for excellent presentation. We're going to move into a quick plenary discussion before we open the floor for questions, comments. As all speakers point to, the private sector and the public sector both have really important role to play in moving forward to a landscape approach. So joining the panel, besides the speakers, we also will have Arnaldo Canelo, who has a really deep experience in interacting with policymakers and other stakeholders. He has been an advisor for the Brazilian President Office Strategic Affairs Ministry for integrated landscape approach in Brazil. And Arnaldo also joined us in the FOREF's Brazil dialogue, and he also contributed to the CCAFS research on the cattle supply chain. And he will be helping us to understand the public sector side of how we can move forward on the landscape approach. And also, it's my honor to introduce Uta Youngerman, who is the project associate for the Forest Solution Group at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's a group of, the Forest Solution Group is a group of 25 global companies who is working on forest products value chain, aiming to bring more of the world's forest under sustainable management. And in this role, she also participated in our FOREF's Brazil dialogue, and she will speak to the private sector's efforts towards more landscape integrated approach. And just to take advantage of let me first ask a Brazil targeted question, as we have such a deep experience from all speakers in Brazil. We already heard about two innovative approach, the FOREF's partnership, and then the coordinated policy intervention and certification that the CCAF and Imaflora presented. I'm just wondering if the speaker can speak to what kind of other innovations that are emerging or are needed to reduce agricultural pressures for deforestation among commodities such as cattle and soil. And just feel free to speak freely.
So, good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity. Well, I think the first message is that innovation or improving technology, sometimes there is nothing to do with deforestation. So let's take deforestation as a broad view, not as a forest, but let's consider the whole natural ecosystems in Brazil. The most affected ecosystem right now in Brazil is the savanna area, the Cerrado, which is a kind of savanna-like. And it's on the Cerrado where we have the most innovative, the most improved, the most technological agriculture in Brazil, which is the soya and corn production. So I don't think innovation can bring us to low deforestation. If we will look into the Amazon, and 2 days ago, I think some of you has been touched by the new informations about deforestation. The deforestation, unfortunately, has increased a little bit, almost 30% in relation to the last year. And unfortunately, the deforestation right now is not really connected to the main commodities. Deforestation is mainly connected to a social problem, to a social exclusion. If we look at the historical descending of the deforestation in the last 10 years, mostly connected to the enforcement, it will be quite effective on touching the big portions of the deforestation, let's say the big polygons of deforestation. But most of the deforestation right now, 75%, is connected to small polygons, which means small settlers almost abandoned by the federal policies, which are not assessing technology, which are not assessing markets, and they are just using their own technology, and it means deforestation. So that's something new. Another thing new in the deforestation in the Amazon is, first of all, the main driver was lining. It means roads. Actually, the main driver is points. There is a lot of improvements or new infrastructures coming through the Amazon, mainly dams, hydroelectric dams. So if you look at the most municipalities involved on deforestation right now, they are mostly peri-urban areas close to these points. So that's also something new. Concerning the 4Fs and the deforestation, I would say, I think in Brazil we need more than 4Fs. And I think the idea of a multi-sectorial dialogue should be adapted in country by country. The sectorial dialogue in Brazil is quite improving. And we have in the Amazon a good example of a private agreement. A little bit forced by Greenpeace strategy, but it was a private agreement. It was the soya moratorium, which is unfortunately is saying that they will not continue signing for the soya moratorium, even with the deforestation going now. I think that the sector which is making right now quite big efforts, which has big impact on the agriculture fields as a broad, including livestock and forest plantation, is the livestock sector. Historically, that was the sector involved on frontier expansion in Brazil. Now it's less and less involved in expansion. And the intensification of the livestock is something key in Brazil, because all the other sectors, if you consider the 4Fs, the other 3Fs, they have huge plans of expansion to attend global demands. So we can solve the new demands and the new challenges coming to the agriculture in Brazil if we are capable to intensify livestock and promote transition between livestock and soya or corn or forest plantation or sugar cane. Also in the 4Fs, we should include family agriculture. That's clear in Brazil, the expansion of the big agriculture has been confining small agriculture. And there is no doubt the strategic role the family agriculture has in Brazil for our own food security. Another F important is fresh water. We have a lot of dependent population on fresh water. So that's a key F to be included in. And finally, a new F and a new issue, a new challenge in Brazil is the implementation of the forest code, which brings a new F to our land use planning strategy. We have been trying to improve our capacity of land use planning at the government. But what is important to understand is that the new geography, the new frontiers in Brazil is mainly pushed by the private sectors. The government is so weak on the territorial plan, and it's even not capable to promote new frontiers. We have been trying to improve such a capacity by using two main instruments. One is incentives, credit, a more regional approach for the credit, and the other one is to use infrastructure to improve agriculture, to promote livestock intensification, and then to promote transition. I think that's the main message I would like to share with you.
Hello? Hello. Hi. It's working. So I'd just like to add innovation in the public policies in Brazil, that it's the low carbon agriculture emission plan. That it's something new. It's like around 2 years, and now it's getting bigger and bigger. And this plan stimulates and gives credits for producers to implement good practices with low emissions. So this is still like a seed, a very small thing, but the NGOs, we are really there to push this and make this bigger, and because we also believe that with the intensification of the cattle production, it's very important to reduce carbon emission, decrease deforestation, and also we should incentivize the best practices. And it's all this package of good practices, rotational grazing, genetic improvement of the livestock. All these packages is inside the low carbon agriculture. So there is a a hope for us. Thank you.
When we were at the Brazil Dialogue in Capo Bonito, we visited 3 different farmers on 3 different scales. One relatively very small farmer, a medium-scale farmer, and then a large-scale farmer. All 3 farmers had the ability to kind of go to each other's farms. And it was really fascinating. The small farmer was basically, for all intents and purposes, he was growing everything he needed on his land, and he had everything. And it was so integrated and so technically precise, and yet very much living with the, within the means that he had. He wasn't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. And he would gain income from selling worm castings from vermicomposting projects that he did on an impressive scale for such a large farm. And he also made cachaça that he would sell to his neighbors. So he had income from that, but it was so integrated, it was so fascinating. And then the mid-scale, the medium-scale farm was, just to say, the small farmer was being advised by a local NGO. Very interesting kind of interaction that they had. The medium-sized farmer was primarily producing eucalyptus, but he had learned how that he could intercrop with either soy or corn, depending on what the market was, and then a fodder, cattle fodder, in between his rows for eucalyptus. And he showed, to everybody's amazement, that actually his monoculture of eucalyptus actually was less profitable than the intercropping he was doing, the agroforestry basically that he was doing with fodder and grain. The large-scale farmer was at both farms, and it was amazing. He was relatively unaware of these other innovations that were happening in the same landscape he was. He was so focused on single commodity and chasing the market and export to some degree. But I remember very clearly after that, he was one of the strongest proponents of an engagement mechanism locally in Capo Bonito because he wanted to have more time with those farmers. He wanted to understand what they were doing, and he wanted to see if that model could work on the large scale that he was at. So I just, for me, it was so important, and it just reinforced the notion that if we help create these platforms, a lot of this innovation can start to filter through and higher up the food chain, as it were.
Thank you. They're all really interesting examples, and as demonstrated by the experience in Brazil, there's quite a big spectrum of different innovative approach on the landscape that's emerging from a small farmer to a national level low carbon policy on agriculture. So I'm just wondering, how do we actually assess the sustainability of this different approach? And I want to pose this question to the second group of presenters because you briefly mentioned the framework that you are utilizing to look at from standardized lens on how sustainable those different landscape approaches are. Wondering, can you explain a little bit more from your experience, how do those different interventions really lead to or demonstrate sustainability?
Yeah, sure. So I think we can use the SEN as a good example. So as I mentioned, it sets a high criteria for sustainability. And we can sort of give an example of that based on comparison with some other interventions. So I'd like to, for example, when you compare it to the forest code, as I mentioned, is a very strict law for forest conservation. And so we have, just to describe it a little bit, the forest code, one of its requirements is that every private property has inside its property a certain percentage of forest that can't be deforested. So in the Amazon, these values vary according to the biome, but in the Amazon you have to keep 80% of your forest area intact. So this is considered, if you deforest more than 20%, it's considered illegally deforestation. So the forest code, the new forest code, considers legal now producers that have deforested, that had committed illegal deforestation before 2008. So everyone that has committed illegal deforestation before 2008 is compliant with the law, which if we go to the CCAFS program, as Marina mentioned during the presentation, no one who has deforested before, after 2005 can achieve certification, for example. This is one of the examples. Another one also regarding the legal reserves or the forested areas is that the forest code just asks to keep the forest, but the CCAFS program requires that some sort of fences or the animals are not allowed to get in the reserves. Because what happens, and we could see sometimes, is that the cattle sometimes get into the reserve to access the water bodies, and you can have erosion because of that. So this is another factor that shows enhanced sustainability from the CCAFS program. Also, regarding traceability, the cattle supply chain is very complex because you have some calves raised in one farm and they're sold to many other producers and passed through different producers in different areas, and it's really hard to track where the calves are coming from. They go after through informal trades or different ways, very informal trades, till they get to the fattening farms. So it's a long process till they get to the slaughterhouses, passing through different and many producers. So it's very hard to track if this cattle is coming from a deforested area and after going to a legal producer. And although there are some programs that are developed to track this, they are, the first one, the CISBOV, is still, it's changing now, but it's still voluntary for the ones who want to export. And they're not really effective. Whereas the CCAFS program is the first to assure that all the animals are coming from either from certified farms, so they have to come from either certified farms, or the producers have to know where the cattle is coming from. Many were saying, well, I don't know where it comes from. I just bought it in the market from a friend and so on. So they have to know exactly where it comes from, and it has to come from farms that haven't deforested after 2005. So this is a very important for showing the sustainability of the CCAFS program. That's it.
If I can just build on what Helena's saying. Xiaoting asked how we could use, I guess, our framework to think about when actors have improved their sustainability. And I think that rather than knowing what sustainability is and when that's been achieved, we have been mostly thinking about meaningful improvements or enhancements in sustainability. And so what is a significant step forward from the status quo or from the current situation? And so to borrow some language from RED Plus, I think we can think about at least 3 components that are necessary for an intervention to improve sustainability, that are necessary but perhaps not sufficient. And so additionality, avoided leakage, and permanence as being things that any intervention has to build upon to at least move anywhere towards enhanced sustainability. And so I think, as Helena's just described, to use the SAN program as an example again, I think as Helena's just described the environmental criteria, the strict environmental criteria of the SAN program, I think they very well demonstrate the additionality in terms of an individual farm or actor that becomes certified. But as you've heard from Helena and Marina, the challenge is that so far the SAN program has done a great job of certifying a very small number of actors. And so the challenge now is to scale that. And so the extra additionality will presumably come from achieving scale either by recruiting more actors to participate, by increasing the area, the numbers of units of production that are certified. And again, I'm using the SAN program here as an example of this. I guess this could apply across any intervention. And also by thinking about which actors are included. And so in the case of SAN so far, it was those actors that were already at a very high level of sustainability who kind of incrementally improved, but by a relatively narrow fraction. And so obviously if you can recruit and improve the sustainability of producers who are, or actors who are further down the sort of sustainability ladder, then the additionality is greater. The concept of avoided leakage, I think a lot of interventions do a great job of improving sustainability in this one place, but often that may just displace or transfer the problem to somewhere else. And so something like the transparency aspect of SAN is really useful in kind of overcoming some of that challenge, and by increasing the transparency for the entire chain. And in terms of permanence, I think it's a little more difficult to assess, but I think just the demonstration of the sort of the proof of concept, if you like, that it is possible to certify actors within the cattle supply chain in Brazil was something that a lot of actors doubted a few years ago, that was that even possible. And so the demonstration that one can certify cattle from birth to slaughterhouse to supermarket shelf is important, and that together with the sort of, as Helena indicated, the sort of raised bar of sustainability, this sort of new high, maybe something that a lot of actors expressed to us when we were interviewing them in Brazil, so maybe that's going to sort of shift perceptions about what is possible and about what the criteria for sustainability should be, about where the industry or indeed any other commodity industry should be aiming. So if you can set that bar, even if it's unachievable to most, if you can put it at somewhere that's meaningful, then maybe that will sort of change the perceptions of the sector as a whole. And I guess what this kind of, I'm going off question a little bit, but what that comes down to, and whether it's, so is this idea of kind of pioneers or first movers, or those who are basically leading within sustainability. And so whether it's the farmers that we spoke to at the 4Fs dialogue that Gary just talked about, or whether it's San Marcelo, or someone who's basically prepared to go out there and say, well, it's, I'm going to take a chance on this, or I can see non-financial benefits, indirect benefits, or because it's, they have a cultural sustainability, or for whatever the motivation is, to go out there and be the first people and to demonstrate that this is A, possible, and B, desirable, I think is one way to encourage others to also move towards enhanced sustainability.
Thanks, Pete. And thanks for bringing us more to the international level and a look at what we can learn from the Brazil experience as well. So I think it's a perfect segue for us to switch gear a bit to look at the international level of discussions and how this session's information can be linked to the Global Landscape Forum. As the Polish minister this morning mentioned, that he's really looking for a democratic, horizontal way of landscape decision-making. And that, Gary, you also speak to a more new integrated and a participatory approach towards landscape land use and how you can make decisions around that. I'm just wondering, so how can we move, what in your view and from your experience, how can we move from the current paradigm of this top-down land use decision-making and this more fragmented way between different sectors in the landscape space, how we can move them towards more integrated and bottom-up, or as the Polish minister put it, the more democratic horizontal land use decision-making?
Well, clearly, and certainly from the perspective of my organization, the key is to find effective means of engagement for all the stakeholders across the landscape. And I noted in Sarah Scher's presentation during the opening ceremony, she also laid out some of the key aspects of engagement and what that might mean, and how to bring people more effectively into the process. We have seen, not only with our 4Fs initiative work, but in a variety of our dialogue initiatives, where particularly we have an initiative on RED+. It's almost universally called for now that there be engagement mechanisms, stakeholder engagement mechanisms. But I would suggest that primarily what we see are more classic consultations rather than engagement and dialogue. When these platforms are established by not just government, government has to be there, but a variety of leading actors on the ground at a national and also at a local level. And it's a challenge, but it's a necessary challenge to figure out a way to help a variety of individuals that may not understand how, may not have the capacity, may not even have all the information. So to help build the capacity for them to be able to engage and then create a mechanism that works for them for engagement is key. But it's also the biggest challenge that we see. But that, at its very nature, is more of a bottom-up than a top-down approach, and that's what we're helping to look at, trying to look at through the 4Fs, but also in a variety of our other initiatives.
I just want to add something to this. I think, yeah, it is very much about capacity building, but it's also about building trust effectively between different stakeholders. And so it's about transparency, building trust, and also then with that managing the different risks to avoid mismanagement. I just wanted to add to that.
Uta, since I think I just want to put you on the spot here as well, because we talked about the participatory approach and the bottom up, and definitely the private sector will have a key role in leading some of the efforts going forward. In your view and from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development view, what's private sector's role in leading forward in different innovations in land use decision making and governance?
Thanks, Xiaoting. I think for the private sector, the role is so important because the private sector has the capacity and the resources and fundamentally the market access to innovate and also to scale up the solutions. So business can serve as a solution provider. It can help to build the capacity on the ground, and it can provide the technology to help do that. So nonetheless, of course, there's a shared responsibility between the private and the public sector. So to scale up effectively, public and private sector needs to work together. The public sector as the enabler, providing the enabling policies for business to scale up and to provide those solutions. So business needs to start managing natural but also social capital, while governments need to provide the environment for business to do that. So I think the private sector can very much lead with best practices. It has the convening power, really, and it also has the power to bring stakeholders together. And at least with the companies that I work with, they're ready to do that.
Great.
Yes, I'd like to add, because I have a question for the audience. It's like, where is the commitment of this, the private sector? You know, I would like to see the commitment and also the transparency of this commitment and the monitoring, reporting, and the verification of their purchasing, because they pretend to be committed with sustainable supply chains, zero deforestation, but until now it's not easy to see the transparency in the supply chains, where the products are coming from and where they are going to sell these products, and where we can see these reports, where is the transparency. So I think there is a lot of opportunity working on that field. Thank you.
Do you want to respond to that?
Sure.
Well, I think that's exactly what we're working on, and at least for the companies that I work with, we work on sustainable procurement guidelines. We work with certification systems. I mean, forest certification is already, or has been around for 20 years. It's in a sort of in a stagnating process at the moment, but I think that there are solutions out there to work further with smallholders, to empower communities and act on that and to build more transparency into the supply chains. This is not an easy process. It takes time, but the commitments are there. The Consumer Goods Forum, for instance, which represents, I think, 400 retailers and brand owners, has committed to zero net deforestation, or helping to achieve zero net deforestation by 2020, and is more and more developing sourcing guidelines and best practices for the different commodities, including, of course, pulp and paper, but soy, beef, cattle, and so on. So I think the commitments are there, at least from the private sector.
I think I take up enough time already, so I'll just open the floor for questions. And I think we have an online audience that's been patiently waiting to interact, so I may just take a first question from the online audience.
Thank you. I don't think that the online audience have been very patient because there's been quite a bit of a buzz. I'll summarize a number of questions and remarks. It basically comes down to that we don't know whether we should laugh or cry. On one end, we hear a number of positive stories and examples where a landscape approach is really working. On the other hand, there was a reference made to an article in BBC News yesterday where the Brazilian Minister of Environment announced that there was that the good trend in decreasing deforestation in Brazil has been reversed in the last year. It didn't go up by a little bit, as the gentleman said, but by 28% in 1 year. And then it was quoted that most of the sources were because of roads or insufficient law enforcement. So the big question is, in how far, if indeed the main sources of this negative trend that started again is caused by roads and new development and higher demand and a lack of sufficient law enforcement, in how far would a landscape approach that really change? Thank you.
Anyone from the panel want to take that question?
Thank you. I'm Deepak Rugani from Biofuel Watch and the Global Forest Coalition. I wanted to raise the issue of bioenergy as it hadn't been raised by the panel, and particularly in relation to Brazil. In the UK, we've got targets which mean that we are aiming to produce a full 12% of the entire electricity production from bioenergy by 2020. There's 15 mega biofuel power stations, biomass power stations in the pipeline, and just to feed them will require 10 times the entire UK production of wood. Now the process has already started, and it started in the Cerrado. We're now seeing the first evidence of deforestation in the Cerrado to provide wood chips specifically for British biomass power stations. Now, you mentioned, well, the last speaker just mentioned about some governments needing to provide the environment in which safeguards can occur. Well, actually, it's the government that's driving the destruction, and the targets are so high that no amount of sustainability standards or greenhouse gas carbon calculators or anything else actually make any difference. So we've got quite a serious situation here, and I suppose that's further compounded by coal-fired power stations now looking to move across to co-firing with biomass as well. So we've got power stations like Drax in South Yorkshire, which are building up to 50% power by wood. And of course, they can only burn hardwood. It's hardwood with low bark content. It's at the moment coming from the southern US, from swamp forest, very highly biodiverse swamp forest being drained. But of course, all eyes are on Brazil to provide that hardwood. So I wanted to suggest that one thing I'd like to do is open up the debate a little bit here about bioenergy. It seems to me to be the elephant in the room, and it seems that you know, the emphasis from the panel has been on carbon pricing, supply chain management, integrative aspects, all things that are really valuable and, you know, we would endorse. But the problem is that the scale of this means it's taking over wholesale. So between now, 2013 and 2020, we're going to see an explosion of demand for wood pellets for bioenergy, not just in England, but also throughout Europe, in the US, in Japan, in South Korea, and in China. All these countries have got massive targets set. So I wonder if the panel could speak to that, because it seems to me that this is all, first of all, it's happening at a legislative level. Secondly, it's happening in the name of mitigating climate change. And of course, as we all know, bioenergy is hardly carbon neutral. Thank you.
Great. So I think it's basically related to policy, not only in Brazil, but also international policies that are driven different land use decision makings behind in other countries as well along the supply chain. Any speaker want to speak to that two questions?
Yeah, maybe just a few numbers, because I think we have always difficult to approach the Brazilian scale of land use. In numbers, the Brazilian agriculture, agriculture, livestock, and forest plantation corresponds to 6 times France on surface. We have 70% of this whole surface dedicated to livestock activity, with a very low index of productivity. That's why it's very welcome when the cattle sector starts to improve their productivity. If we look at the whole demands, and of course when we see millions and millions of hectares and we don't know the Brazilian scale of land use, I think we fell quite quick on the drama. We have been studying for such a long time how the demands can increase, and they will, for sugarcane, for biofuel, for soya, for maize, for livestock, and forest plantation. And I can guarantee for you that so far from the Brazilian scale, the potential to improve land use in Brazil is much higher than the whole demand which can come from the coming decades. So our key word in Brazil, and I think that we should apply for the private dialogue, is efficiency. We should improve efficiency on land use. That can save our forest, that can save our cerrado or savanna or whatsoever. So we are far to improve at the level of the technology, which is known on the country. We are far to really have a better use of our land, our anthropic land. I don't mean fresh, new land. So I don't know if I really answer your question, because I had a problem to understand your question. What do you mean by that? The big expansion, the big demand of biofuel in Brazil. The other side, I don't know if you know the oil palm expansion in Brazil. It's by law located on the degraded lands. So that's another strategy to be applied on the 4 Fs. Expansions of the whole sectors in Brazil should be first made on the degraded lands, on the livestock lands, on pasture lands.
I'm just simply saying that that's not happening.
It's happening. No, sure, it's happening. Maybe we can talk later. I can give you so many numbers. Of course, it's happening. And I hope it will continue happening. If we can have a help from the 4 Fs dialogue of 6 or 7 Fs, I think we go maybe much more quick. But it's happening. I think we should not look the present situation. Let's look at the historical situation and how it's going better and better. I think you are a little bit informed, but I can help you and bring you some new data. Sure.
Any other speakers for the first two questions?
Maybe I can add, we have some initiative we developed together with the coal firing sector, a monitoring system that the wood will come only from the planted forest, so from eucalypto planted forest, not from natural ecosystem anymore. So the sector is organized now and committed to reduce the use of coal from natural forests. So, but we are still in the beginning.
I think the fact that there are policies out there that actually, there are policies out there that want to achieve one objective, one sustainability objective, providing, let's say, more sustainable energy. Whether that is true or not is another thing. But that's the thing, these policies do cause adverse effects, and that's what the 4 Fs is all about. It's about actually trying to eliminate these adverse effects between different sustainability objectives. So I think in terms of bioenergy, the EU simply has objectives by 2020, and I'm not quite sure whether these policies make the right business case. So that's a big question mark.
And maybe I'll just respond to the aggregated online audience with their joint question. And I think it's perhaps really just to, and perhaps we weren't explicit enough, but just to draw attention to this. I guess no one is, at least I don't think on this panel, is saying or pretending that any single intervention or program or idea or initiative is possibly going to do anything more than improve one small part of the whole picture. And this is, the land use and environmental problems in Brazil are obviously enormous and extremely complex. So I don't think that is in any way to diminish the value of a well-designed and well-implemented and well-integrated and coordinated program. And I think as we've highlighted, the strategic coordination of as many of these programs as possible together can only help to produce a better outcome. And if you have lots of interventions acting in different dimensions or in parallel or even in conflict, then that's obviously going to make less progress than if we can coordinate. But for sure, like, as much good research is, our research project here is looking at one narrow question. There's a whole load of related ones that would be fascinating to look at. But I think that, there is obviously no silver bullet, and thinking about small steps towards enhanced sustainability can only be a useful thing.
Thanks, Pete. I think the small steps is really the key here, that it help everyone move towards a bigger goal of sustainable development. Any other questions from the audience?
Hear me, it's Ross Hampton here from Canberra, Australia. Any other Australians here today? I'm not, because I need support for my advocacy for another F, and any Australians in the audience would have said there definitely would be 5 Fs up there, and the 5th F I think is represented anyway on your slide, Gary, which is, I presume that's charcoal that's being carried in the picture, because we would never have such a slide in Australia without fire, without bushfire being present. And as we saw in the Brazilian slides, there's quite a lot of eucalypts in Brazil, originally from Australia, and they're causing us a very, very large carbon problem in Australia. Do you know, about half a dozen years ago, we had a fire in Australia that emitted more carbon dioxide, or CO2, greenhouse gases, to our atmosphere than our whole national accounts in one go, in one fire event. We've just finished a pretty large fire around the edge of Sydney too, which has been doing much the same sort of thing. So my question is to those folks who've been working in Brazil, whether you have been studying any effects for reducing the fuel load in the forests, even in the plantation eucalypt forests, with a view to reducing the carbon emitting events, because this is a very large piece of work in Australia, and we face a real dilemma in Australia because I think, as our colleague at the front desk said, there's a real move internationally to not use the fuel from naturally regrowing forests for good reason around the world, and yet because that's also largely the case in Australia, we have no way really at the moment of reducing some of that fuel load, which we wait with crossed fingers every Christmas in Australia, waiting to see which bit of the country is going to go up in flames. So I'd really be interested to know if there's been work in Brazil around any sort of removal of the fuel load.
Let's take 2 more questions.
Yeah? Okay, thanks. Simone Lovia, Global Forest Coalition, Sobrevivencia, Paraguay. First of all, my compliments to organizing this session. I'm very glad that we are addressing cattle and soy here at this session. We'll actually do so at the next session at 4:30 as well, upstairs in 114. And then we'll be looking more at the issue from a rights holder perspective, because of course there's a bit of a difference between rights holder and stakeholder perspectives. First, I can't help but reacting on the issue about intensification. Yes, it is important, but there's very convincing scientific literature by Kajmovic and many others actually, that the real thing you need to look at is that it becomes more labor intensive if you want to spare forests. And then the 3 worst types of land use are actually 1, cattle, 2, eucalypt, 3, soy. Those are the ones that provide least jobs per hectare of land in Brazil. And these were figures from the Brazilian women's movement of peasants, the Movimento de Mulheres de Campo. But I think it's a bit funny that you call certification an innovative approach, because it's actually very old, and I think I agree with the person who said it was stagnating. And it has actually had very dubious results until now in terms of the effectiveness, also because it doesn't address quantity-related aspects which are inherent to sustainable forest management. I mean, per definition, the more wood you take out of a forest, the more unsustainable it becomes, and certification per definition cannot address quantity-related aspects. And in fact, in many European countries, and a lot of the producers are now asking for more government intervention and upscaling. And I was quite fascinated by the slide you showed with the different actors, producing policies, because there was a lot of purple government thing. So one of my key questions is, what do 7 supermarkets really add to the entire big picture? And the other big thing I missed was social criteria. I think the missing F is also very much forest-dependent peoples. And there seems to be no attention for any initiative for land grabbing and land concentration, which is of course a massive problem, both in Brazil and especially also in Paraguay. And in fact, the social movements themselves have very strongly rejected similar certification initiatives in, for example, the soy sector, particularly the peasants, but also other massive social movements. But you also sort of seem to indicate that in Brazil, the big farmers are more sustainable than the small farmers. I don't want to, critique Brazil because I'm not from there. I know in Paraguay it's by far the biggest farms, and the funny thing is they're mainly coming from Brazil. There are a lot of Brazilian farmers that are causing havoc now, and it's increasing. 600,000 hectares of forest were lost last year, and we're sort of suspicion that it's part leakage from Brazil. So what do you do to address such leakage? And of course the intensification, if you intensify and then you go over to soy production, also is leakage. So how can you address leakage in these programs? Because for the climate it doesn't matter where the deforestation takes place, in Brazil or in Paraguay.
So I think Simone's question packed many other questions, so I just stop here and give it back to the panel. We had 2 new Fs, the fire and the forest-dependent people. And there's also a question on the intensification and then what's new about certification.
Thank you. I think those are all really interesting questions. Certainly ones we've thought quite a lot about. There were quite a few there, so I'm not going to try and answer all of them. I think the the question of international leakage from one country to another is a really fascinating one. In some respects, I think international programs, therefore, and wherever you stand on certification, something like the SAN program is an international program, so is the RSPO certification. I think whether it's certification or some other mechanism, having governance interventions in place that span national jurisdictions is probably a positive and certainly interesting to look at, in the sense that, as you otherwise, traditionally a lot of governance interventions have been at the national level, and so as you rightly point out, that can just, you might solve it in that country, but if it just displaces it to another, then globally in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or deforestation rates, that doesn't really help. And so I think it's really interesting to think about any policy or incentive or whatever it is that spans multiple countries, and that's the case if you particularly because a lot of producers who are, for example, look at the palm oil sector, a lot of producers operate in more than one country. They operate in Indonesia and Malaysia. They also now have moved into West Africa. If they've already committed while operating in Indonesia and Malaysia to the RSPO standards, or to, as we've been looking at with Golden Agri Resources, a big palm oil company that's developed its own set of standards, those apply to the plantations of all of their plantations in any country. So international mechanisms can presumably help to solve some of those leakage issues. The question of the demand side, of the consumer side, I think is hugely important. It's not something we've had a huge chance to look at yet, but I think changing consumer behavior and consumer demand and buy-in to more sustainable products, or indeed dietary shifts or whatever it is that reduces pressure, particularly given the increasing global human population, is obviously extremely important, and it would be interesting to explore some of the mechanisms that are acting from that side and at that point on the supply chain. So, in some ways, certification acts at both ends by providing an incentive to the producer and also information and to the consumer. But there's certainly space for a lot more to be done at the consumer end. I don't know if you want to just.
Can I just add something that you mentioned about the how to measure if certification is effective or not? So there is a more need for evidence-based to see if certification really adds up to sustainable outcomes and so on. But we can see from the criteria that it can add up to sustainability, even though there isn't yet evidence-based research on that. And I have more comments. Well, that's it. Any?
Can I just add something on certification? I think the concept of certification itself is not that new or that innovative. However, it is approaching, or it is being applied for more and more commodities. I mean, with forests, it started, I think, 20 years ago, and there has a lot of things have happened, and I think now it's not about calling certification new or something innovative, but that you actually innovate certification itself, and I think that's where a lot is happening at the moment, and it's about finding new approaches to certification that include small forest owners or small farmers, in other cases community forestry, community agriculture, indigenous peoples, and so on. So I think that certification can still provide a lot of on-the-ground, or a lot of improvements in on-the-ground performance and so on. It's just we need to find new approaches to certification itself, but not question certification.
Just a quicker reaction on the leakage. I think Brazil is not impacting only Paraguay, but it's impacting also Bolivia and soon maybe Colombia, because there is a new frontier in Colombia, in the Llanos. I think that's, well, at the level of the government, on the bilateral discussions between Brazil and Paraguay, there is a lot of accusations, there is no solution coming to the table. From the private side, maybe that's a question to bring into this 4F dialogue. That is, let's see farther than only Brazil. But the question is the social movements, because most of the improvements in Brazil, the exigencies in Brazil, coming comes from social movements. So at least in the Amazon, there is a quite strong discussion on the Brazilian influence or the whole neighbors. In social movements, in social lawyers' defense. Not in Paraguay. I don't see any social movement coming from Paraguay, so maybe that's a big lack.
If I could just touch on a couple of the points as well. In terms of intensification, I think it's really clear that that's a debate, that's a discussion that needs to happen. We don't assume, and in fact, intensification may not provide much of an answer to the challenges of meeting demand. You look at the land sparing question, you know, does intensification really lead to land sparing? And I think there's increasing evidence that it doesn't. It actually leads to more expansion as it becomes more efficient and people see that the profits are there. Again, that's where an integrated kind of landscape approach is necessary to address those types of questions. Whether or not intensification itself isn't going to solve a problem, but it might contribute positively. But I agree that there's other social questions related to that are really important. Land right issues and labor issues are also important. So our point is to have a conversation about it and as broadly as possible. We actually had a suggestion that we have an indigenous peoples focused 4Fs dialogue. And we're taking that proposal on board and we're going to explore it. Most likely it'll be in Latin America. So that'll be focused obviously on not only traditional but also innovative ways that indigenous peoples are dealing with landscape management and taking a landscape approach, which I think is much older than some of the approaches that some of us might be recommending. And finally, I don't want to forget about Australia. Apparently you are the only one. And we're not really looking at fire per se. The 4Fs, the reason we use the 3Fs in front is they're basically commodities that are affecting the forest. There's a lot of other Fs, and absolutely every dialogue we have, somebody brings up more Fs. We have a long list of Fs, and it's just really effing long. But it's good, they're all important. But in this case, we're looking at food, fuel, and fiber as commodities that are impacting forest conservation. But also, I was just thinking, in answer to your question, I understand the UK needs wood, and you guys have wood that's burning, so just, if it's cost-effective to ship it from Brazil, it may be cost-effective to ship it from Australia. So talk to our UK friend there, and Commonwealth can solve the problem. Yeah, that's it.
Great. I think we just discovered some new business opportunity in this room. We're pushing towards the ending of our session, so I'll just open the floor for the last round of questions. Oh, yeah. Anyone with the mic?
Hello. Hey, thanks. Thanks for the time. My name is Mark Maroche. I work for the Rainforest Alliance. We do a lot on standards and certification. We're a member of the SAN. So we get behind the cattle standard, and Rainforest Alliance certified as it applies across broader crops, and we help to cook up and still invest heavily in supporting smallholder producers, forest-dependent communities in implementing the principles and criteria of the FSC. So just a little bit of context there. And I really appreciated your comments and the discussion that we're having around this, and just wanted to reflect on a few things quickly. I think and we can continue talking. I hope that we will continue talking later, but certification evolves. It's not a static concept. There are periodic, really rigorous and robust public consultation phases. I think that those stakeholders engaged in that community learn things as they apply it, and then they try and integrate those into kind of successive iterations of the standards. There might be, I don't know if it's already started, but it will be soon if it hasn't, I think, the public consultation phase around the SAN standards revision that's starting right now, and it's a multi-year process. So we'd really encourage anyone with concerns or experiences to share those with us so we can take them into consideration formally. Second, if you look at these initiatives globally, you're talking about impacting several million hectares under the scope of the SAN standard, 100 million or more under the scope of the FSC standard, a lot of different country contexts, a lot of different dynamics in which you're working. It's a very complex world that we live in, right? So I suppose in some contexts, certification has been more valuable than in others. There are some really interesting case studies that we've developed in different places, such as Guatemala, El Salvador, around things like coffee, sustainable forest management. And we'd be really happy to share those with folks who are interested. You can come see me right after the event. And then spinning off, I don't know if we have time, but I would be really interested, Helena, if you could talk in a little bit more detail about that slide that you'd had around benchmarking different initiatives and trying to, you know, move folks from the floor and shooting for the stars, and if you had any more kind of prescriptive ideas around what that might look like. Thanks.
Thank you for the comment and question.
Hello. Hello, my name is Clara Secker. I'm representing FAO, European and Central Asian office here. And thank you for your valuable presentations on your experiences. And you started with the food insecurity issue as a basic problem. And one point what I was missing is the food waste problem. So actually, we are talking about food security, and in the developed countries, basically food waste is 30 to 50%. So we have to definitely deal with these bad consumption patterns, and it's a bit related to the biofuel issue. So the bad policies, bad consumer behaviors are driving these bad land use approaches. Thank you very much.
Remember, there was one more hand. Oh, yeah.
Hi, thanks for your presentations. I'm Stephanie Rowe from Climate Focus, and actually building on also what the gentleman from the UK said and what you said FAO is looking at, you know, some of these kind of more elephant in the rooms, and one thing also that I think wasn't really mentioned was demand. I mean, I think that, you know, it was mentioned that beef is probably the most inefficient commodity produced out there. And so, I mean, are we looking at potentially shifting demand to other more efficient proteins, and looking at what policies and what, you know, initiatives can be promoted? I'm not sure if you mentioned it was 70% of beef production in Brazil is consumed domestically. So I mean, I think that there could be a lot of potential there in terms of being able to shift some of that demand, and not just from an environmental perspective, but also from, you know, a health perspective. I mean, there's numerous studies out there that show that, you know, red meat is basically a source of, especially in the U.S., a source of heart disease and other things. And so I just wonder, you know, what can be done potentially in Brazil to address this issue. Thanks.
Yeah, just a new happenings, let's say, in Brazil. There is a change on the way Brazilians consume protein, animal protein. We are increasing pork, and we are increasing fish. And there is now a policy to improve fish from freshwater fish production. But another thing to consider is that we have a new emerging middle class in Brazil, which has a stronger capacity of consumer. We have, from the last 10 to 15 years, we have a 40 million new middle class coming to consume like us, eating 3 times per year, or per day, at least. And of course, they are pushing the whole demands for animal protein, for energy, for infrastructure. And it's also a cause of, let's say, a little shake. Because before we have a country for 20 to 30 million people, but we are 200 million people, and we have 40 million people coming. But on the queue, we still have 80 to 90 million people to become a middle class like you and me. So demand will increase, at least in Brazil, in China as well, I think, for the same reason. So, of course, there is a waste, there is an inefficiency, maybe we can improve other sources of protein, but it's still the demand will increase. And it's legitimate. I don't think we can change that.
Any comments specifically on the demand side and food waste questions before I give Helena the floor to answer that specific?
I would just like to compliment Arnaldo and say that, yes, it's exactly as he said, the medium class has increased, so demand will increase. So maybe it's necessary not only to reduce demand, but to change the way these products are consumed. So I understand what you say about health, and this is starting to being discussed in Brazil. So the matter of red meat, of unhealthy. So that's a need for a sort of a change in consumption patterns, but it hasn't really happened yet because it's still emerging, so it's very new. I don't know if anyone has another comment about demand. So just to explain a little bit of the slather figure that we had. So we thought it was a really nice way of showing the context of the Brazilian cattle chain in Brazil, because it's so heterogeneous. You have producers that that are not compliant at all. They were just given land by the government and they have nothing, no technical assistance, no information. To the big farms, very large farms that own like a large amount of the cattle herd in Brazil, and they have more access to, some of them are really sustainable. So we didn't want to show that the SAN cattle certification was the final aim, but it was just another tool that increased the sustainability criteria of the cattle supply chain right now. So we thought that if we have this bottom-up approach, we're going to be able to increase the sustainability, so help with compliance and other issues that are going on with the context right now. And so once you have a more homogeneous sector, you're going to be able to, more people are going to be able to access the certification. That's because many are not right now. I think that was the main idea, to relate the context with the interventions and how they are correlated. I think that's it. Hope I answered your question. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
The precision, almost 80% of the beef production in Brazil is internal consumer, just to give you an idea.
Just a quick final comment on the aspect of food waste. I think that's very, very relevant. And I know that within the WBCSD and with our scoping of our own 4Fs platform and working group, we were working with a lot of agribiz companies to improve efficiencies along the supply chain, because it's not just about the food waste that is wasted on the consumer side, where companies can work with the consumer to improve efficiencies, but also the food loss along the value chain. So, and I know that the World Resources Institute is working on a food waste protocol, and I think is kicking this initiative off very soon, or it already has. So I think it's very relevant.
So I have been informed that we're running out of time, so I'll just give the other speakers the last chance to make a point, and also I got a request from one of the speakers to pose a question to the audience as well. Can everyone probably bring this conversation back to where at the Global Landscape Forum we're organized in conjunction with the UNFCCC negotiations. So the last comment, if you can just briefly comment on how this discussion can help inform some of the international policies. And on the other side of the coin, how those international policies and negotiations can lend support to this more bottom-up land use governance and decision-making. Gary, can we start from your end?
Yeah, thanks, Xiaoting, and I just want to thank everybody for coming out and listening to us and adding your ideas. This was a good discussion. And just to reinforce it, that we're on the early side of this, we have a lot of work to do, and some of the questions we can't answer because we haven't gotten there yet, but the work continues. And I'll just come back to the theme that I always come back to, and that's I would encourage the governments and negotiators to think very clearly about the type of engagement mechanisms they would like in place. We hear at every level that engagement is necessary. Everybody gives it lip service. But when we actually see the platforms that have been set up or being developed for different engagement mechanisms, to me they're rather unsatisfying. And I think there's some key aspects that the governments need to help support. And by that, I also mean that to bring in other stakeholders in the establishment of these platforms and have them be ongoing. But I'll just leave it at that, that platforms for engagement are key from local all the way to global.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention that some of the key messages that we brought at the end of our presentation would be important to pass along, of how important it is to enforce the compliance and to have coordinated and complementary interventions, so you have a path towards sustainability and decreased deforestation and therefore greenhouse gas emissions. So it would be extremely necessary to have a commitment and also coordination between all of these initiatives.
So I would like to add that, of course, certification is not the tool that is going to solve all problems. It's a combination of many tools, public policies, and all these initiatives. So certification is just one more tool to add sustainability to the supply chain. But the main message, I think, is to the engagement of the stakeholders and also the transparency of the supply chain, so we can know where it's coming from, where it's going, and not only about buying, but working together with farmers to change the sectors. Thank you.
So I would complement what Helena, Marina, and Gary have said, and maybe you talk from my role as a researcher to, I guess, call for a stronger evidence base and a better impact assessments of different initiatives and interventions, so that we can talk with a greater and more in-depth understanding of what works and in what contexts and why. And so, you know, often that's difficult, and often there are not data available. But I think to conduct interventions or design interventions to really be able to evaluate them afterwards and say, did that work, or is it working? Are we on the right track? Do we need to alter our approaches to improve the outcomes?
Better than a key message, I just want to use my time to ask you a question. Between you, who is completely engaged on sustainable products? Consuming, of course. Who? 100%. Who is completely engaged on certification products? On your main consumer? Okay, thank you.
I just echo, I think, what Gary said. It is fundamentally important to find these platforms to engage different stakeholders, and I think that governments can play a fundamental role in providing that platform and then the frameworks to work together and find innovative approaches to the challenges that we face. So I think we need to listen to one another and understand different perspectives to find solutions together that eliminate, ideally, any adverse effects between different land uses or other sustainability challenges.
Great. I just want to thank all the speakers and all of you guys in the room for being with us for the whole 2 hours, and also the online audience for posting questions and following us online. Thank you. And feel free to stay behind and ask the speakers any questions as well. Thank you.
And also, there is an interesting discussion about land use intensification and forest code implementation on the room 107, 108. You are all welcome. Thank you.